We're going to get started in a minute. We wanted to just say hello to everyone. Stephen, do you want to go ahead and
I will.
start with
Thank
your
you.
introduction?
I want to welcome everyone this afternoon on behalf of the Mirowitz Center. We're very excited that you've joined us for this program, Stitching History from the Holocaust. Before I introduce our guest speaker, though, I do want to give a shout out to Laurie Burdak-Miller, who should be on this Zoom call. Laurie is responsible for bringing this program to our attention, and I want to thank her for doing that. I know it's going to be worthwhile for all of you. So, by way of introduction, Ellie Gettinger, who is joining us today, is the Education Director at Jewish Museum in Milwaukee. She has led the museum's educational efforts since 2007, a year before the museum opened. She helped develop JMM's contents and is responsible for developing curriculum, workshops, and tours, and she trains volunteer docents to assist with group tours. Through the museum, Ellie works to build understanding of diverse topics, from immigration to the Holocaust, to Jewish community, to different populations, from preschool to older adults, for Jews and members of the non-Jewish community. Ellie was a principal researcher for Stitching History from the Holocaust, and she recently curated JMM's original exhibit, Blacklist, the Hollywood Red Scare. She was named to the Milwaukee Business Journal's 40 Under 40 list in 2017, and the Coalition for Jewish Learning honored her as a Green Spoon Educator of the Year for her work. She has a bachelor's degree in Jewish studies with a focus on history from Stanford University, and she received her master's degree from the Spertus Institute. I also just want to acknowledge that this program is being co-sponsored by the St. Louis, the Friedman-Feldman Holocaust Museum, and we're very grateful to them for their co-sponsorship and support of it. Thank you very much, and welcome, Ellie.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be in St. Louis this afternoon. I guess it's probably good I'm in St. Louis this week and not last week when the Brewers were playing St. Louis. So now we're peaceful, we're friendly again, and we'll wait until the middle of the season when things go off the rails. And I'm just delighted. One of the COVID silver linings that I've been able to engage in is that, first of all, taking an exhibit like this, Stitching History from the Holocaust, which I believe Lori saw something about that was in a museum in Iowa. It's an exhibit curated in 2014. So generally, once an exhibit closes up shop and is put away, I have to say, well, that was a fun exhibit. You know, if it travels, maybe I'll get to talk about it some more, but I don't have the chance to delve into it regularly. So this has been a true silver lining of COVID for me, to be able to continue to engage with these exhibits that really are kind of, in some ways, they're like my children. And I'm very passionate about them. Also, shout out to Larissa Klebe, who's here and is a longtime colleague from way back. But I'm excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I have another screen open. So if chats or things going on, things you want to respond to, please throw them in there. I know Judy's going to curate for me as well, but I'd love to hear from you guys and hear what you think as we're going through this. As a museum education person, it's always more fun to have it as a discussion. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and computer screen here.
Yeah, I see your PowerPoint. I'm not seeing you though. There you are.
Now you're
You're a little delayed.
Right, you guys can see.
You're a little
Can
bit
you hear
delayed.
me? Can you see me?
I can see you. You were a little bit delayed in the voice.
Is it still delayed?
It's better, much better.
I think sometimes my computer just needs to catch up with me. And once that happens, we should be off and running. So iPad Nancy, is that a real hand raise or is that an accidental hand raise? If not, you'll jump in later and you'll tell us what's up. So this exhibit starts in a place where I think many of us have been in our lives. By show of hands, I'm looking at the board here. How many of you have downsized or helped someone else in your life downsize? And been up, I see Kent has done that. Anybody else? Downsize Nancy has done that. This idea of you're cleaning out your house, you're going from the 4-bedroom, ranch style house, and you're moving into the Mirowitz Center, you're moving to a condo, you're downsizing, or you're helping your mother-in-law or your mother, someone in your family. And I know there's this point in that process when you get to a place and you just say, I want to burn everything up. I'm just ready to throw it all away. I don't even want to look through any more boxes. I don't want to know what else is in these closets. And starting place of this story. It was started as a family was going through in the 1990s. And the gentleman at the start of this was a guy named Bert Stranad, and he was looking through his mother's basement to try and get her into an assisted living facility. So he is helping her downsize. And in that process, he comes across a dress like this, and also a letter, and another letter, and an envelope, and all sorts of interesting things that he had no connection to. His father had died 30 years earlier. His mother at this point couldn't tell him the story of what these pieces were. And he turned it over to the organization that became the Jewish Museum, the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society, with the hopes of preserving them. So I always like to say that this is a story of archives, this is a story of preservation, and this is a story of carefully perusing your stuff, because who knows what's in there. It's also a story about bringing a vision to life. These designs that we're going to explore today. Ellen is thinking about downsizing, but is having a going, well, maybe this will inspire you. This is a story about bringing a vision to life. And these dress designs were sent in 1939. And we worked with a really fabulous team in order to bring together each detail to have a better understanding of the story of the Holocaust. And I think in some ways it's a story of the Holocaust that we aren't telling, because it is a little bit harder to tell this kind of story. And we'll talk about that as we go through. This, as I said, was the beginning. It's a letter, just a simple letter written to Mr. Alvin Stranad on South Kinnick Street Avenue in Milwaukee. This is just south of the city. You can see the date there is December 11th, 1939 on the post there. That envelope was this. And I think that's really the thing that got Mr. Stranad's attention at first. That idea of he's opening up his father's and mother's materials, and they have something in their basement with a swastika on it. He had no idea of. And it says there in German, geprüft, which means approved by the Oberkommand of the Wehrmacht. So a commander in the Air Force has said that this is okay and it can go out. And inside this envelope, and actually in a separate envelope, were these 8 dress designs. You can see they're all very different. They're colorful. One of the amazing kinds of, moments of serendipity with this story is the fact that this lived in a basement in Milwaukee near Lake Michigan for many, many years, where the water table is quite high, and all the basements there flood. And for some reason, these were not flooded. I feel like that's one of the little saving graces of this exhibit. And then there also is a letter. The letter is in English. It's a fabulous artifact to share with groups, because I don't have to mediate what it's saying. I don't have to take the moment of translating. It's all there for you. You can see the date, December 11th, 1939 again. And you can see it's really the most beautiful script. The part I like to key off of here is this. You may imagine that we have great interest of leaving Europe as soon as possible, because there is no possibility of getting a position in this country. And then he goes on to say, by separate mail, I've sent my wife's dress designs. I hope the manufacturer you mentioned in your last letter will will like them. Now, if you look at the date of this letter, December 11th, 1939, this is 3 months after the start of World War II. And if you're in Czechoslovakia, like Alvin, like Paul, the guy who wrote this letter is, then you know it's even later after, the Nazis occupied. The Nazis come into the Sudetenland, the kind of perimeter of Czechoslovakia, in October of 1938. And by the spring of 1939, March of 1939, they have taken over the Czech portion, what would now be considered Czech Republic, and that is under Nazi occupation. And the Slovakian part of the country is a Nazi, is under Nazi control as like a allied government. And so, the Jews of Czechoslovakia have already been impacted. And so the question here I always had is, it's so quiet in its desperation. There's not this big sense of the war is starting, here's what's impacting Jews. And because of that censorship, Mark, that's what he needs to say in order to get this out. You have to have the kind of most limited amount of language. And the only thing he's presenting as a challenge is the fact that you have great interest of leaving Europe as soon as possible because they can't get jobs. So just the fact that they're unemployed, not the fact that their jobs have probably been limited for over a year now, but just that unemployment is the challenge that he's pushing in this letter. When JMM opened, we made a centerpiece of our Holocaust exhibit. And you can see this is what the original dress designs look like on display in the museum. We took the picture of Paul and Hedy that we found, and we made that large. We took the envelope, and then we put a facsimile of the letter itself. But we hadn't really been able to find much information about the family, so we didn't have any additional pieces to add, just the fact that this was a desperate plea that went unfulfilled. And that's kind of the messaging in our permanent exhibit. And as we were opening, if you've ever been part of a museum or a big project like this, when you open a museum, there's this sense at the end that you're like, I have just gone through a marathon. And it's probably more of those like super marathons, like the 150-mile ones. And I'm just going to take a break for a while. And so we had a visitor who came in very after we opened, and she was like, this is a great museum. We really appreciate everything. We really love the way you're telling stories. But, and there's always that but, you're like, oh, what's the but? And the but was, you could be doing so much more with those dresses. And we're like, oh, great. Thanks. Good feedback. Awesome. And the visitor, who, this is where it gets a little personal, it happens to be my mother. So she always is this person in my life who can give me one good idea that just takes a lot of work. She's like, you could make them. And I'm guessing a number of you on this call, also in your backgrounds, have grandparents or parents or aunts and uncles who are in the garment industry, either as tailors or seamstresses, or they worked in a factory, or they owned a factory, or they owned a department store. And for my mother, who worked, whose both of her grandmothers were seamstresses, this idea of the material culture of seeing these dresses come to life brought back to her this sense of watching her bubbies work. And so there felt like there was something there. And we set this idea aside as we worked on developing our museum, our tours, our programs. And suddenly, as we became more kind of together, we started thinking about what it would look like to make these dresses. What does that mean? And we had all sorts of thoughts. Is this like a solo one-day kind of program? We make the dresses, we auction them off. And that felt wrong. It didn't feel like it fulfilled the legacy of what we would want to do. And we started moving in the direction of creating an exhibit. But the real challenge was we didn't have that much information about the people at the center of this exhibit. So how can you make an exhibit about people with no real information? So these are the kind of questions started as we thought about this as an exhibit. Who are these people? We know that he has a cousin in Milwaukee, and we know that he wrote this letter in pretty beautiful English. We have no idea who she is. We don't even know her name. He doesn't even acknowledge, my wife blank. He just says, my wife is a talented dressmaker. You're like, would you be helpful? And we don't know at this point what happened to them. So it's really, there's so many questions here and no real answers. So if we're going to present this as an exhibit and create these dresses, then we need to figure out how we can tell this story. Luckily, we started this process in 2010. And even if we did this process in 2005 or 2006, it would have been challenging in different ways. But by this point, the Yad Vashem database of names is available online, and it makes research much easier for a small museum in Milwaukee. Instead of thinking about, oh, we need to go to Yad Vashem and see what they have, we can see what they have from our computers at home. And when I was in the exhibit opened in 2014, when I thought back to this part of the research process, I remembered there being 13 Paul Stranads, and I had to triangulate which one lived in Prague and birth dates. And that is where sometimes your memory builds up all sorts of challenges. And in this case, the was and he's listed as murdered. So it's amazing things. Says grandfather owned a woman's garment factory. So it is that sense of like fashion stories and clothing stories is really part of kind of the fabric and totally intended who we are. Through that Paul Stranad site, we were able to find a page for his wife. And you can see here, she's listed as Hedvika Hedvig, and her maiden name is Anshul. You get some information from this. It includes her birth date. And one of my favorite details on her, it includes another picture of her, which we loved to be able to see as many as we could. And it includes her profession as Lady Tailor. So we now have a sense we've met our designer, Hedvika Hedvig Stranad. The thing is, there's not that much more information that's present there. And so this becomes a research project in and of itself. The person who submitted the page of testimony is a woman named Brigitte Rohacek. And Brigitte's maiden name is Newman, and she is Paul Stranad's niece. She's one of his sister's daughters. Wife of Paul Stranad, my uncle, mother's brother. And you can see the date of registration is, her birthday is from 9/3/30. So when I'm looking at this, she's in 2010, she's already 80. And the other thing to note from this is that the address she lists is in West Germany. So we know that this document was created before 1989. So this becomes my next point of discovery. I'm going to find Brigitte Rohacek, and she is going to tell me everything that I need to know about Hedvika and Paul Stranad, and this is going to be my conduit, this first person connection to their story. So Google is magical for things like this. And if you typed in Brigitte Rohacek in 2010 into an internet search engine, you would find exactly her, and it was the appendix of a book called Kinder Transport and Trauma. So it gives you a little bit of a sense. Oh, I see that I'm having delay issues on my computer. Is the choppiness my internet or yours? Everyone's having trouble. Okay, let's figure this out before we go on.
So let me just tell you, this is Judy. Yeah, you're sometimes your video is delayed too. So I'm not sure.
Let's just turn off my video. You guys are okay hearing me without my video, right?
Yeah, well,
let's see
yeah.
if that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, you're still, it's not coming through clear. I heard that and that was it. So.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Say a couple more things.
Let's try this now. Brigitte Newman Rohacek.
No, it's
How
still,
is this? No, it's still choppy.
Yeah.
Huh. I've shut down most things.
Could I make a suggestion? Sorry to jump in. If there's a call-in number for this Zoom room, Ellie could call the phone number. Ellie, better quality.
Well,
I always have difficulty with that. Like
Yeah.
my phone, for some reason, doesn't connect there. I can also switch my audio to the other computer. And let's
maybe
try
that's
that. How does it
okay.
sound now? Any
maybe that's okay. Say some more.
is it still bad or is it okay?
I think it's
Say
better.
some more.
Sounding better to me. Sounding better to me.
So we're looking for Brigitte Newman Roacek. How are you guys? And it might help if I speak more slowly. I will try and do my best with that, Marcia.
You're
not
you're clear now to me. How's everyone else? Yeah, people are saying
Yeah.
better.
Great. Okay. See, teamwork makes the dream work. We'll figure this out. So did you guys get that we're looking for this lady, Brigitte Newman Roacek? Yeah. So she becomes this fixation of mine. I'm going to find her and we're going to figure out where she is. My first point is going to Google. I find this book that she's listed in the appendix of, and my hope is that the academic will be able to just turn her right over to me, and it will be a very short search. And this is the response that I got when I reached out to the author of Kindertransport and Trauma in 2010. And she says, in 2001, I contacted her by phone. I spoke to her only once. I'm afraid I have not got her number anymore, nor do I remember where she lives. She's going to look through some old address books. She'll let me know. I'm like, okay, that's disappointing, but not the end of the world, right? We can make this work. We'll find her. It'll happen. And literally, if any one of you said to me, if Phyllis said, I'm going to Germany, I would say, Phyllis, can you help me find Brigitte Newman Roacek? If Shulamit said, I'm going to Germany, or my son is in Germany, or my cousin's grandson's personal trainer is in Germany, I would have convinced you that that personal trainer needed to be part of this mission. And despite all of these efforts, nothing really came of it. And so we kept trying to find other ways of connecting and building the story. One of the things we did is we built, we worked with a number of academics from a number of different backgrounds, through immigration history, through fashion history, through Jewish history, to piece together the pieces of their stories to show how they would have been like other people in coming from Czechoslovakia, other people who were dressmakers or tailors, how the fashion fit into the fashion of the time. So we were piecing together a bigger story using this micro history, but we didn't have much in the realm of detail. But there was another big piece of this that would not have made the exhibit that we needed to put together in order for the exhibit to function, and that's the dresses themselves. Our initial thought is we would find some sort of seamstress who would take on the project and just project manage just as one person. And every sort of fine seamstress we found, people who do wedding dresses, people who do big projects like that, their sense was, this is too big. This isn't the kind of work that I do. We went to some of our local universities who have fashion schools and said, hey, do you want to help us with this? And they did not feel like their students had the components in order to make this happen. And then there was again that moment of serendipity that happened throughout this exhibit. We at Jewish Museum Milwaukee were hosting the first rehearsal of the Milwaukee Repertory Theater's performance of Anne Frank. And this was like the first rehearsal is their kind of dog and pony show to show their funders what's going to be happening in this performance. They show off the costumes, the lighting, they do a small scene read. And it's a lovely moment to be in partnership with the local community organization. And by the end of that day, my boss had convinced the costume shop manager for the Milwaukee Rep that this was the project for them. And if you think about it, a theater group is the perfect group to take this on because they're used to doing historical reconstructions. And they also really understand the process of researching time periods. The things that make them less obvious as a choice is costumes are very different than clothing. When you're designing costumes, it's to be seen, 20, 40, 50, 100 feet away, and there's big details, and you're not necessarily going to spend your time covering buttons or doing fabric squares or figuring out insets, because who's going to see that unless it's really bright and showy? So again, in that spirit of serendipity, one of the people who worked for the costume shop, who still works there, is a woman named Jessica Yeager. She became our project manager, and Jessica's fashion kind of fixation is the 1930s and 40s. In her spare time, she's a USO reenactor. And so she came to this project with all of this language of clothing from this time period. And then she brought that language and helped us figure out how to create these pieces. The other thing they pointed out immediately is we gave them 8 dress designs that have no notations on what the pieces are made from. There's no backs to any of these pieces. There's no, there's no sense of style of how things are put together, which is normally the sort of thing they would have from a designer. So they had to do an incredible amount of interpretation. And what you're looking at here, which looks a little crazy, if you look in the middle, these are the dresses that we gave them. These are Hedy's designs. And as you go out from each dress, this is the research that they are pulling in order to figure out, well, what does the back dress like this look like? What sort of hats how would that hat be affixed to a head? What are the ways in which you're getting that kind of volume on a dress? And so they're pulling all of this research into one kind of giant research board, vision board, as it were. And it's a really, really kind of complex thing. I think of it as being like the fashion equivalent of like that serial killer board in one of those crime procedural dramas. This is what this was, but it really did give us the sense of their through line on what they were thinking for each of these dresses. So the work of interpretation was, if you look at this purple dress, which is one of my favorites, a purple coat, they decided it's more of a coat than a dress because of especially the way the scarf is up there. And the big interpretive question here was, how would you create these insets? Is that a different fabric that's patterned? Maybe it's a stripe. Is it a different texture? And they went back and forth, and through their research, they determined that those insets were actually just ruched, and the diamonds were formed by creating the shape, but then putting the inset of the ruching in there from the same thing to give that feeling that she's showing with her lines. So this is the interpretation. You can also see behind there that anytime they would create dresses in less expensive fabric so that they could test all of their theories. And then by the time they're cutting into the actual fabric that they had purchased, that it's like really perfected at that moment. If you're a big costume shop nerd, as I am, and you want to see more of these details, you can go to the Milwaukee Repertory Theater's costume shop Pinterest page. And if you look for Hedvika, you will find all sorts of information about the work they did, and also the sorts of things that were kind of central to their research, like this 1930s patterns from, I believe it's Sears. But these are the sorts of things that inspired the floral dresses and gave them an insight into how those floral dresses would have been created. They really were so careful with construction and details. There were a couple of things that I think are really interesting. They set themselves some challenges that we did not. They decided that they could only really use techniques that would have been available to Hedvig Strnad in the 1930s. So while they were using sewing machines, they wouldn't use anything that was serging. They wouldn't use anything that that had complex computers. It was basically just using forward and backward stitches because that's what she would have had available. The other thing is that they sourced vintage zippers and buttons and notions as they could. So for instance, on one of the pieces, there was a vintage belt buckle that they found that worked really well with one of the suits, but they only found one of them. So they created a cast and cast the other one and to make the exact match of it. So we have 2 of each of the pieces, one that travels, one that stays back just in case. And each of the techniques, like covering buttons, covered buttons, and slit pockets were the sorts of details that they would never really use in a theatrical performance, but would be the sort of thing that a 1930s dressmaker in Prague would have had at her disposal. So those were those challenges that they put to themselves. And I think it really does make the authenticity of their recreations feel more kind of as a homage to Hedy, and really not just an homage to Hedy, but as a recreation of her work. One piece that we did not entirely anticipate is that there are a number of print fabrics. There are 3 of the dresses have print fabrics, and you're like, ooh, maybe they'll just find something that's similar. And again, their attention to detail was at a level that we had not anticipated. In not the costume shop, but in the props department, one of their colleagues was a screen printer, and she set about screen printing each of these fabrics. And so here is a little bit of her, and hopefully my screen will work just fine. This. And the sound is less important than the actual video here. But hopefully we'll get Margaret too.
That's a dye, and you can charge from the catalogs. Okay. You know that it's going to be in the range. And sometimes you need to also make sure you've got a red if you need to cool it down a bit and get it more towards a purple. Not a hot red, but a cooler red, or it needs to be green, look at a yellow that's allowed to kick over the edge for the blue. That's how you print. You print a different stencil for each color. But since this is rayon, I had trouble. By the time you ran, a quality of rayon is that it can continuously shrink if you're not careful with it. And so even in the steaming process in this small range, I couldn't quite line up my stencils again to print color. And since it was this kind of a pattern where things were essentially separate enough, I ended up hand painting the color on, which, you know, in production, nobody else would do that. And there's probably other ways to do it better. But this worked fine for what we're doing here.
That's so much work.
It was a bit of work. Water and a thickener. Different thickeners that can be used. This one is sodium alginate. And basically I'm going to end up measuring out a certain amount of this in my measuring cup and then adding the proper amount of dye. But this is a nice consistency because it allows the dye to not seep when I print.
I think that was the thing. I was so unaware of how much science and math went into this process to create these fabrics, that it's an intense amount of that. And I actually want you guys to see her printing.
Still need to fuss. I want the blue to be a little more intense. Oh yeah. And the red, I think the red changed it. But it darkens up in the steaming process. This is a little closer to that. So
this is,
so
you can see she actually had hand painted in all of the black because that was the color was so she's just going through right now and adding the blue pieces, the blue to this
this is the one fabric. When you went to the rep, this is the one you were taking pictures of, and you were cut that.
And it's just an incredible amount of work that was so meticulous, and it's so added to the vision of the exhibit that you could see the fabric that was seemingly drawn by Hedvika Strnad at this point and sent to America. So this is what that final of that blue, the one that she was making at the end, that's what that looks like. And it's just pretty incredible just how much work. She actually ended up doing that. Not just for this was on a raw silk. She did this on a very shiny silk. So she had a lot of different, she had to think about it with different fabrics for linings and things like that as well. And we'll get back to the dresses in a bit, but I want to go back to research. In fall of 2013, I got a request from a young man at Lawrence University in Appleton asking for a summer internship from October. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked with interns before, But generally right now is the time that I start lining up my summer interns, because they're starting to think about, it's actually March is more, but an October request is really unusual. And you're like, what's going on that this kid is so on top of this, that he knows in October what he wants to do in the summer. And he replied, oh, I'm lining this up because I'm about to go to Germany for a study abroad. And I'd really like to have this in place to know what I'm doing when I get back. So of course, as you guys know, if anyone says they're going to Germany, my question is, can you get in touch with Brigitte Neumann-Rowacek? And he does. He actually sends an email giving him no direction. He sends an email to the exact same academic that I had sent an email to 3 years previously. And she is at the University of Kempten. She is a German academic. I neglected to say that earlier. And he writes, instead of in English, in German. And you can see, if you could read German, you would know that his name is Tyler Grasse, and he's telling about her studies, and he's explaining the museum's exhibit. And this is November 8th. 5 days later, he gets this response. Hi, Tyler. I'm glad to be of help and wish you luck with your project. The address I have is blank. So all of a sudden, we have Brigitte Neumann-Rowacek. There she is. And this is actually a picture that was taken of Brigitte by her cousin, an American cousin, one of the granddaughters of Bert Stranad, whose father, Alvin, so it's one of the daughters of, so it's a granddaughter of Alvin Stranad, whose father had received the letter. They are like third cousins or second cousins once removed. And they had no idea that they had family. And she had no idea she had family in America. And Karen, who went to Germany and then to the Czech Republic with Brigitte, had no idea that she had family in Europe. And this became the beginning of a relationship between them. Brigitte here is seated at the memorial at the Prague train station to Kindertransport. She's one of the 600 children that was taken to England by Nicholas Winton, and she was actually on the last of those transports. She was 9 years old at the time that she left. She's one of the youngest children. And one thing that I can tell you about Brigitte is that her parents were intermarried. So her mother was Jewish, her father was not. He was a doctor. He was good friends with Paul Stranad. And he ends up in a concentration camp, but is probably treated a bit differently because he is not Jewish. Her mother dies in the Holocaust. Her father survives. And after the war, she goes back to Czechoslovakia and lives there and becomes the kind of conduit and the holder of the family stories. So there are a number of things that we learn from Brigitte. First, and I've been saying this, switching off names, but we to this moment had been calling the person at the center of this exhibit Hedvika. Remember, it said Hedvika/Hedvig Stranad. And we just thought Hedvika, the Czech variation is so much more charming. But she informed us very quickly that they were very proud of their German identity and they spoke German in their homes. And that Hedvig was the name she went by. And more often than not, she went by Hedy. She remembered as a small child going to her aunt's studio, where the people who worked for her aunt would make her doll clothes. So suddenly we have this vision of we never knew if Hedvig was a sewer on her own, if she worked for someone. And suddenly we know she not only owned her own shop, but she had people who worked for her. And she also told us her aunt had red hair. She was a smoker. Those tiny details that start filling in who a person is. They were always laughing. They were jolly. And they were very much a partnership. Those were the sorts of stories we got. And it's a really complicated question. We asked a woman who is 80 years old to remember not her mother as a child, but to remember her aunt and uncle. Think about that. We're asking her to remember 70 years previously to say, tell us about your aunt and uncle and what you can remember. And these were the threads of details that she could give to us. And it really did help to frame out some answers. The other thing she gave us was a new letter. This is in German and it's addressed to her father, Ernst. And we didn't end up using it in the display because it's pretty complicated. It talks a lot about people in the family and what they're trying to do to escape. This is in dated February 1939. So it's right before Prague becomes occupied by the Nazis. And it's basically going through all of these different family members, in which there's another Hedwig, another Paul. So that felt very complicated. But the other thing that we discovered at the bottom of this letter, and again, I have to thank my intern Tyler, who translated this for me and said after, because I was like, I can't read this. He noted, hey, did you see Hedy's signature at the bottom? At the bottom of this letter, there was a little dashed off note that says, love to your children, and it's signed Hedy. And suddenly you get a little different sense of her. Even just seeing her handwriting against her husband's. Look at how orderly his handwriting is. Look at how it's so meticulous. And hers is like this kind of swooping, quick note. It doesn't have that same kind of sense of purpose and style. But the signature itself felt like it was very connected to the clothing. And our partners at the Milwaukee Rep helped us create a label for her dresses using that signature. So they took that because there really was this sense that we wanted the dresses to not just feel like this is her work, but we wanted to be labeled with her work. So this was a design they came up with based on labels of the day that were similar, taking her signature. And it gave us just this kind of nice connection to her artwork, which we love to be able to share. As we were nearing the actual display of the exhibit opened in September 2014. In the summer of 2014, our friends from the Stranad family in Milwaukee were preparing for an interview with PBS NewsHour. It was a great interview. We really appreciated it, but they started going through their family photo albums and they started discovering pieces from the Stranad family in Europe. So like this picture, a very young Paul Stranad and his 4 sisters. I believe this one is Brigitta's mother, Helene. And within this picture, everyone in this picture, aside from Paul's mother, who had died in the 1930s, every one of these people died in the Holocaust. And the one thing that really struck us as we were doing this research is that Paul's father, Moritz, was the oldest son. He's the oldest son of the oldest son. And he had taken over the family business in Ostindnadleben, Aussig, which is in Sudetenland. His younger brother, Benedict, Alvin's father, had come to this country because he did not take over the family business. And he set up his own store. It ends up being a department store in Milwaukee. So he goes into the family business, but he has to do it in America because he doesn't have, he's not the person who's taking over the family business in Europe. And the difference of being able to immigrate or willing to immigrate in 1903 when Benedict did, and being saddled with the responsibility of your family business as Moritz is the difference in the fates of these families. Just that moment. The fact that one could take over the family business and one needed to go to America to make their fortune. And we just were so intrigued by this. And even more remarkable is they found another letter. And this letter is dated October 24th, 1938. It is for everything that our first letter had in terms of the information that was missing and the holes that were in there, this cleared up endless numbers of questions. It starts by saying, you will of course have read in the press what a catastrophe has overtaken our country, because this is before it's censored. So there's a little bit more freedom of information here that he's able to actually say what's going on. He goes on to say, an unavoidable consequence of these events will be that the influence of Germany will greatly increase. This is less than a month after the signing of the Munich Agreement. And at this point, Prague is not occupied. The only thing that's occupied is the Sudetenland, and yet he still sees the writing on the wall in this country. And if you can imagine what this will mean to us Jews living here and how it will threaten our means of livelihood. Even now, strong anti-Semitic tendencies are making themselves felt. Such tendencies has never even existed before in this country. These tendencies will probably not be able to be kept in bounds, and one may even presume that they will spread all over Europe. Nothing will remain, therefore, to do but to adapt oneself to the circumstances and to consider immigrating from Europe. He goes on to tell about his wife, who has for the last 17 years run a dressmaking studio of her own, and himself, he's a banker. He never presents his own professional life as the thing that will help them immigrate, because he knows bankers are a dime a dozen. It's the Great Depression. That's not going to be the sort of thing that transfers. But people need designers, people need sewers, people need seamstresses. And so potentially his wife's work actually could get them affidavits of necessity. He also addresses the fact that they both know English fairly well. And I think his letters are evidence of his pretty amazing English capacity. When we opened the exhibit, we included that letter. We had to do massive amounts of changes at the last minute to include this information as we found it. We changed things up. The letter is right here on our intro panel. And the dresses themselves became the real centerpiece here, a way of talking about her story and who they were and what they tried to do in dresses that were never made, dresses that never got to come to this country. In that kind of bigger picture of the fashion industry in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe in total, much of the workforce was decimated. Many of the people who worked, and you didn't have massive factories working at this point yet in Eastern Europe, much of that comes later. And a lot of the reason that there's a real hold off and kind of ready to wear in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, besides communism, is the fact that the people who probably would have been at the forefront of those kinds of businesses were killed in the Holocaust, as were Hedy and Paul Stranad. By the way, this picture back here is another one of the Stranad family in Aussig. And this is Paul right here. You can barely see it, I know. But this picture also came to us 2 months before we opened the exhibit. That was one of those last minute additions. We're like, oh, we have to have that one as one of our background panels. Oh, there you can see. There's Paul Stranad right there. And again, these are the images. This is the one of the 3 printed fabrics. And even the like details here where you see, and hopefully you can see that there's a pleat that goes one direction and a pleat that goes the other direction, and the diagonal belt loops, that these were all details that they brought to life, that I don't even know that I'd ever really noticed that there were diagonal belt loops until I saw them. They had a milliner on staff who created all the hats. They sourced all the accessories. In the case of our gown, you know, if any of you are sewers, there are 8 yards of fabric on that skirt. It is immense. It is so slippery. It is incredibly hard to sew that. And one thing they realized is that they weren't going to have the capacity to realize the fabric flowers on this image. So they outsourced that to a firm in New York that's been creating fabric flowers since the 1890s. So that was, their crafts people were so amazing, but also just so good at knowing what they could handle and what they couldn't handle. This exhibit debuted in 2014. It traveled to a number of places. We reopened this exhibit in Milwaukee in 2018. And one of the programs we had was with the former ambassador to the Czech Republic, whose mother had escaped from Czechoslovakia in 1942, quite late. And after he spoke about his mother's experience, he came to me and he said, you know, I think I have something for you. And the next day he sent me these 3 images of Hedy. And you can see the signature's the same and the face is the same. And you get to see her. This is her as a teenager. This is her as a young married woman. And this is her, this one's from 1937. So it's right before World War II. And we got to see her kind of evolution and growth as a woman. This had been stuff that had been in the collection of Theresienstadt and the Jewish community there, and they had just started digitizing all these pieces. So that's one of the things that we love about this exhibit, is that there are constantly new developments and ideas that come forth every time it travels somewhere. We get some sort of new response or insight into Hedy, into the fashion industry, into this world. And so it's been really heartening just to see how people have picked this up. We know that Hedy and Paul were sent to Theresienstadt in 1942, and we know from there they were sent to Warsaw. And then they aren't on any documentation that we've seen. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but it doesn't exist in the realm of being online. And so for us, it became less about talking about how they died or where they died or what happened to them, and more about giving a sense of how they lived and how you can piece back together the stories of people who were killed in the Holocaust, and how we can understand the loss of not just life, but talent in the Holocaust, that this is really the purpose of this exhibit. I'm going to end today with one of the comments from our historians who is part of the our academic team. Her name is Rachel Baum, and she said, "We have only strands of the life of dressmaker Hedwig Strnad. And yet if you take the letters of Strand and rearrange them, you find Strnad. This is a work of memory, taking threads and stitching them together to give shape to what was lost and stitching that further into our lives. The exhibit on Hedwig and Paul Strnad invites visitors to debate the meaning and interpretations of the artifacts, to consider what it means to remember the Holocaust, and ultimately be changed by this connection with one of the millions of unknown lives lost in the Shoah." So I want to stop my share and my screen on and hear from you guys, because I talked a lot, and I want to hear if you guys have thoughts, challenges, questions.
So you can type your questions in the chat if you like, or you can raise your hand.
And I have to say, Phyllis, I've really enjoyed watching you. You've been my person I've watched the whole tour. So thank you for being such a responsive viewer on the screen.
Leslie, do you have a
Yeah,
question?
I do. We are building a new Holocaust museum, and this has been absolutely amazing. And maybe when our Holocaust museum is open, we can get the exhibit.
We would love that.
Oh, it would be amazing to see. Thank you.
And Leslie, I can tell you, when some of the places that have taken this and it's gone to all sorts of different museums, it actually just finished at the National Czech and Slovak Museum in, I think it's in Davenport, Iowa, but it's been at university museums, more in the realm of their fashion collections, which has been interesting because it is a little bit of a Trojan horse Holocaust story. We get people who would never go into a Holocaust museum seeing this exhibit because they're interested in the fashion element, and then they get the fashion element, but also the Holocaust history piece as well, which we think is really important. And then it's been in a number of Jewish or Holocaust museums as well. When we've traveled it, though, one of the things that's been really interesting is to see how different communities kind of create conversations around it. So when it was in the Jewish Museum at Maryland, they curated a side exhibit about fashion designers in Maryland. And when it was in the Detroit Holocaust Museum in Farmington Hills, I think it's the Farmington Hills Holocaust Center, they had taken pieces from their collection that were related to sewing from camps and things like that people had in local memories. So it's been really nice to see how it becomes part of a fabric, again, pun totally intended, of what that community story can be or how it can be told.
Ellie, I found it amazing that it the fabric colors and painting, I guess it's painting on the fabric, the patterns, I found that very, very fascinating and amazing. I mean, that woman just has a real talent.
She does. She's amazing. She's so great. And I think that was like the thing that, when you're on the kind of academic research side, you feel like this creative side is just going to happen. You're like, boom, that just happens. People can just, I've seen Project Runway, people just pull dresses out of nowhere, right? That's how this works. And it was amazing for them to really educate us on the level of difficulty and complexity on all levels, and that we didn't really anticipate that level of detail. And I think they brought a level of professionalism and attention to detail that without it, I'm not sure that this exhibit would have traveled so many places. I see in the chat, there are a couple of things. First of all, the National Czech and Slovak Museum is in Cedar Rapids. So thank you for the correction. And that was from Lori. And then the other question is, did Hedy and Paul have children of their own? And they did not. And I don't know why. And remember, my conduit to them was someone who was 9 when she left Czechoslovakia. So it's a little bit of a challenge to know, what am I missing there? Who is this person? But it's not, I don't know whether it was by choice or by that they couldn't have children. My guess is probably the latter, but it could be the former. You know, she was a professional. They did have a number of nieces and nephews from Paul's side. And one of the big challenges we've had from a research side is Arnschurl is a little bit more of a common last name. And we've traced her family, but we haven't been able to get any of those firsthand connections in the way that we have from Paul's side of the family. So in my long-term dreams for this exhibit, someday a great niece of Hedy Strnad on the Arnschurl side will come forward. Also, maybe someday one of those doll dresses or one of her dress designs will actually appear out there in the universe too, and it'll be a moment.
That would be fun.
Are there any other questions? Any other concerns?
Hi, it looks like that might be it for today. We're also getting close on time, so I'm not sure if anyone has any questions.
Well, this was a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time and your energy. And it's great to be able to zoom into to St. Louis and to share with y'all. And let me know if there's ever anything else we can do. And if you're in Milwaukee, make sure you come check out Jewish Museum Milwaukee. We're open to the public.
Ellie, we want to thank you so very much. It was very, very interesting and just educational. And, you know, like, I think Leslie said it, I'm not sure, but we'll be excited to have it come if we can here. And I would also like to thank the Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum for co-sponsoring this program with us today. So that makes it all more special. So thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you, Ellie, for such a great program. And we will all say goodbye for today.
I have to thank you also for your patience with my technological difficulties. So thank you. And pointing them out quickly so we could fix it.
Yeah, and you did it. Whatever you did worked, because after you did whatever you did, we could hear you much better. Ta-da! All right, thank you, everyone. We'll say goodbye for today.